In this lesson, we'll talk about method overriding. To override a method means to define a different implementation of it on a subclass. When looking for a name, such as an instance method, Python will first check the class of an object before it checks its superclasses. So if Python is able to find an instance method on a subclass, it will use that one before it uses the one on the superclass. So let's begin by defining a class called teacher, and in its body, I'll define some instance methods. So what can a teacher do? Well, one thing is, of course, teach a class. So I'll define that instance method here, passing in self, and it's going to print a string of teaching stuff. A teacher can also grab lunch. So I'll define another instance method right here, taking self, and printing out a string of yum, yum, yum. Finally, another thing a teacher can do is grade tests. So we'll define that method right here, pass in self, and let's say our teachers are going to be really mean and fail every student, so this will print a string of F, F, F. So now let's define a subclass of teacher, which I'll call a college professor. A college professor is a type of teacher. So here is our class. We're going to make it inherit from our teacher class, which means our college professor is going to inherit all of this functionality. And we can also define additional functionality in its class body. So maybe one additional thing that a college professor can do is publish a book. So I'll define that method right here. It's going to take in self, and it's going to print out a string like, hooray, I'm an author. So as it stands right now, our college professor object will have 4 total methods, 3 inherited from the teacher class and 1 defined within its own body. So what happens if I define an instance method in the college professor class that has the same name as a method defined in its superclass? For example, I can define a grade tests method right here, taking self, and let's say our college professors are a lot nicer, so they're going to print out a string of A, A, A. So this is an example of method overriding. So if we have a college professor object and we invoke the grade tests method on it, because this method is closer to it, this one is going to win out over the one that is defined in the superclass. So in other words, this one overrides or beats out the one that's defined above. So let's take a look at this in action. Below, I'll declare 2 objects. One of them will be a teacher object, which I'll assign to a teacher variable. And the other one will be a college professor object, which I'll assign to a professor variable. So our teacher object is going to have 3 instance methods. We can invoke them right here. Our teacher can teach a class, and they can also grab lunch, and they can also grade tests, and you're going to see all of those print function calls on the right-hand side, teaching stuff, yum, 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 F, F, F. And we know that our professor is going to have their own unique method, like publish book. In addition, our professor object is also going to inherit the methods that it got from teacher. So for example, our professor is going to be able to grab lunch, and they're also going to be able to teach class. That should hopefully make sense. But the key takeaway of this lesson is the grade tests instance method, because this is the example of overriding. So when I invoke the grade tests instance method on my professor object, Python is going to search the object and its class before it searches the superclasses. So because this one is closer to the idea of what a college professor is, this one will win out over the one defined in the teacher class. So for our professor object, our college professor object, it's going to print out A, A, A. It's going to invoke this method. And that's all that method overriding is. If this method did not exist, in that case, this one would be the one that would execute, because that would be the only one defined. But if Python is able to find a closer implementation on the subclass, that is the one that will win out. It is overriding the one that is declared above. And as always, you're not limited to only declaring one method that overrides. You can declare as many as you want. So you can override grab lunch and override teach class, although some would argue there's really no point, because you may then be modeling 2 different ideas. The whole point of a class and subclass hierarchy is that the superclass is going to be able to do a lot of things that the subclass can, and the subclass can then expand upon most of that functionality to do additional things. In those kinds of situations is where a inheritance hierarchy is really optimal. Otherwise, it may be that you're actually trying to represent 2 different things with 2 different sets of functionality. So it's not always the right idea to go for a inheritance hierarchy. It depends on the circumstances and what it is that you're trying to build. That's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one.